Hello and welcome to the Silver Stripe screencast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about how to create custom SQL queries outside of the ORM. So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to light up those date filter links in the sidebar on our articles page like we talked about last time. We didn't quite finish that task. So we'll start by adding those, and then we'll learn how to run a custom SQL query. And lastly, we're going to apply all this date filter logic to the controller and create that filtered list. So looking at the template, we first have to generate a list of all the distinct month-year combinations for all the articles. So let's start by working backwards, and we'll build what we want the end result to be in the template. So in the sidebar, I'm going to comment out this heading section because that is going to be something that we'll address later. We're just going to list all the month-year combinations rather than grouping them by year. So let's create a loop called archive dates. So this is all well and good, but what are these objects? Well, a couple lessons ago, we discussed dealing with arbitrary template data, and this is a perfect use case. These date archive objects need to be iterable in a loop, and they need to have dynamic properties. So we'll need to define them as simple array data objects. Let's now build that list in the model of our article holder page type. So we'll create a method called archive dates, and we'll just return an array list. Now we're actually going to build that list. We're going to run some custom SQL. So we're going to need to run a pretty specific query against the database to get all of the distinct month-year pairs. And this actually pushes the boundaries of what is practical in the ORM. In rare cases such as this one, we can actually build custom SQL using the SQLQuery class. Now, as you can see, we pass an empty array to the constructor because by default, it's going to want to select all. It's going to use that asterisk wildcard selector. So get rid of that just by passing an empty array. And then we can build the query using very self-descriptive chainable methods. We set the from table, we set the order by, and we use distinct. Now, the main advantage to this layer of abstraction is that it's platform agnostic, so that if someday you change database platforms, you don't need to update any syntax. All queries end up in SQLQuery eventually. Site tree get, for instance, is just a higher level of abstraction that builds a data list, and that goes to a data query, which eventually becomes a SQL query object. To build a really custom query, we're just going to go further down the food chain, so to speak, and just start with SQLQuery so we can do it the way we want to without all that abstraction. Now, one major drawback of working outside the ORM is that we can no longer take versioning for granted. We have to be explicit about what table we want to select from. It's therefore imperative to check the current stage and apply the necessary suffix to the table, for instance, article page _ live. Again, it's rare that we have to deal with stuff like this, but when you do, you have to be aware of it. Now, don't worry too much if the query itself is over your head. It's not often that we have to do things like this. What this query is doing is just creating a SKU for each article that contains its year, month number, and month name separated by underscores like this. 2015 _ 05 _ May. And then we use the distinct selector to ensure that we only get one of each. Now, if you're wondering why we need the month name, because the year and month number are really enough to satisfy the distinct flag on their own, the answer is we don't really need it, but it will help. We're getting the month name only for semantic purposes. To save time when we actually create the links on the template, the friendly month name is needed for the user to click on, but the month number is what we need in the URL. So we're just kind of killing two birds with one stone there, generating a SKU that just gets us everything we need. All we have to do now is loop through that database result to create our final list of date objects. So we loop through each record using the next record method, and for each one of those, we explode the SKU into its component variables, the year, the month number, and the month name, and we assign them to properties of an array data object. We also create a link to the date/year/month number route that we defined in article holder. Lastly, we run a query against the article page to get the number of articles that match this SKU. Notice that in this case, we can safely just match the year and month number. We don't need the month name anymore because we're just trying to match that SKU. All right, so the next thing we need to do to make the date archive work is set up that controller action that actually deals with the date, year, month routes. So we'll start by running a sanity check to ensure that we at least have a year in the URL. Then we'll create a start date from either the first of the month or the first of the year. If for some reason the year or month values are invalid and don't pass the stir to time test, we can throw an HTTP error. Now we'll create the boundary for the end date and run the query. So a really key detail of this function is that we return proper DB field objects to the template. If you'll remember from earlier tutorials, controllers don't just return scalar values to the template, they're actually first-class intelligent objects. So by default, they're all cast as text objects. We'll need to be more explicit to ensure that start date and end date are cast as dates. This will afford us the option to format them on the template. You can achieve the same result more declaratively by using the $casting setting in your controller. We're going to discuss that in a future tutorial and clean this up a bit. So let's now refresh the browser and try clicking on some of the date archive links, and you'll see that you're getting the expected results. Now the last thing we need to do is add another filter header for the date filter. So I'll go into my template here on articleholder.ss, and I'm going to check if start date exists. I think that's a satisfactory condition if we've passed at least that to the template. And then we will just say showing start date to end date. And this is where having a proper SS datetime object comes in really handy. We can format the date right on the template. And just like that, we have a working date archive. That is it for this lesson. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below.